It's time we talk about one of the most consequential elections of 2024, an election that has the potential to shape the balance of power between the US and its adversaries, that has the power to make or break efforts to protect the environment and fight climate change. And it's actually not the US election, or actually an election taking place in any one country. Instead, I'm talking about the election for the Secretary General of the International Seabed Authority. The International Seabed Authority, or ISA, is an intergovernmental body created as a result of the United Nations Convention on the Law of Sea, or UNCLOS. See, it's in charge of setting rules for deep-sea mining in international waters. And in July, its 168 member states, along with the European Union, will decide on its next leader. Now, the current one, a man by the name of Michael Lodge, has criticized environmental opposition to deep-sea mining and has been criticized himself for cozying up to the contractors the ISA regulates. And his opposition is Brazilian oceanographer, diplomat, and environmental advocate Leticia Carvalho. And so with how different these two candidates are, the outcome could have significant economic and environmental consequences. Right? And that's because, you might not know, the ocean floor is chock full of cobalt, nickel, and other minerals that are essential to green and renewable energy technologies, as well as having many defense and aerospace applications. And so, the ISA is responsible for handing out contracts for exploration and mining these minerals. It's a big deal. And in fact, the Secretary General is the one who personally negotiates the terms of confidential contracts with mining companies. And beyond that, the ISA is still in the process of finalizing the rules and regulations for deep-sea mining, including environmental protections. But also, here's the big kicker. The United States, the most powerful country on Earth, doesn't get a say in any of it. Or the US actually only has observer status at the meetings where these regulations are being discussed. The US can't sponsor companies for licenses to explore potential undersea mineral deposits, and it doesn't even get a vote on who the next Secretary General is. And all of that is because the US hasn't ratified UNCLOS and is therefore not a member of the ISA. In fact, UNCLOS has never even been voted on by the full Senate. But the US's adversaries, on the other hand, are party to the treaty and have taken full advantage. With seabed mining potentially starting as early as next year, and China in particular is in place to dominate. And with China already having a near monopoly on critical materials found on land, there are fears that the US could end up even more dependent on China, and this would threaten national security, which is why the concerns go way beyond mining, with many warning that China is taking advantage of America's absence from the treaty to pursue overall naval supremacy, which is why there's been a massive push for the US to get on board with UNCLOS. I mean, this year, for example, hundreds of former national security, military, and political leaders sent a letter to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations urging lawmakers to ratify the treaty. And notably, these people include former national security advisors, intelligence leaders, 50 admirals of the Navy and Coast Guard, more than 70 generals from other branches of the military, and nearly 200 U.S. ambassadors. And in that letter, they noted that in the decade since that committee had last considered UNCLOS ratification, China and Russia have taken advantage of America's absence to work actively to undermine critical United States economic and national security interests. And with that, specifically emphasizing the rights of access to deep seabed mine sites containing trillions of dollars worth of strategic minerals that are, quote, critical for both United States security dominance as well as the transition to a greener 21st century. With John Bellinger, a former advisor to George W. Bush, supporting the letter and telling CBS, the United States probably has got the most to gain of any country in the world if it were party to the Law of the Sea Convention. And conversely, we actually probably have the most to lose by not being part of it. And a really key thing to note here is that it's actually a very small group of people keeping the U.S. out. Right? Treaty ratification in the U.S. requires the support of 2/3 of the country's senators. So in 2012, for example, the last time the Senate held hearings on the treaty, just 34 Republicans promising to oppose the measure meant that it never even came to a vote. And that, despite the ratification reportedly having the support of the president, the intelligence community, big oil, major business groups, and the U.S. military. With this, we see opponents of ratification saying there's nothing in UNCLOS that advances America's interests. With Utah Senator Mike Lee, for example, telling CBS, the U.S. needs to reject the constant impulse to cede sovereignty by allowing unelected and unaccountable global bureaucrats to regulate away new frontiers. Ratification today would be a win for the climate lobby and the global elites who feel entitled to govern from the shadows. But to be very clear with that, we are talking about participating in an agreement on how to share resources and territories belonging to no one. This has nothing to do with the land or waters that the U.S. has sovereignty over. And notably with that, UNCLOS declared the seabed to be common heritage of humankind. And it specifically requires royalties and other benefits from deep-sea mining to be shared among ISA member nations, with preference given to developing countries, which is some sort of an effort to make up for colonialism. But in any case, UNCLOS opponents also argue that American companies aren't investing in deep-sea mining because it's not economically viable. Though to that point, Lockheed Martin's holding on to its rights to 2 Pacific seabed sites just in case the treaty does ever pass. And the company telling 60 Minutes that it can't begin operations if the U.S. doesn't ratify the treaty. And actually with that, there are clear signs that U.S. interest in deep-sea mining is growing, with, interestingly enough, Republicans often leading the charge there. Right? Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, for example, has been among those leading the push for ratification. Also, in its most recent defense budget, Congress included a provision that requires the Pentagon to issue a report on the nation's capacity to process seabed minerals. And then also this year, Republican lawmakers have introduced the Responsible Use of Seafloor Resources Act of 2024, which would notably require the federal government to support domestic seabed seabed minerals processing. And that brings me to the next key point with all this, because the most responsible use of seafloor resources may actually be to just leave them there. Supporters of deep-sea mining claim that it would be far less damaging than mining on land. And they argue that it is necessary to fight climate change because it'll allow us to get the metals needed to make electric car batteries, wind turbines, and other green technologies. But that, as environmentalists say, that it would wreak destruction on marine ecosystems. In particular, warning that deep-sea mining could potentially lead to extensive and likely irreversible biodiversity loss and potentially make climate change even worse. And at the very least, a 2022 peer-reviewed study found no or next to no scientific knowledge to enable evidence-based management. Or in other words, basically concluding that the effective regulation of deep-sea mining is not even possible with the information that we have now. And to that point, in March, Denmark became the 25th ISA member nation to call for a pause or a moratorium on mining due to a lack of scientific knowledge about seafloor ecosystems. And I should also note that beyond the environmental aspect, opponents of deep-sea mining have voiced alarm about how much this issue is being tied to national security concerns and competition between great powers. With, for example, Greenpeace writing, as if it was not enough to plan to destroy fragile ecosystems, some deep-sea mining companies are now marketing deep-sea minerals as necessary to strengthen military power, exacerbating geopolitical tensions between world superpowers with worrying implications for global peace and stability. And so at the end of the day, there is a lot of debate about this industry. And so the election we're talking about for this summer, as well as the other ongoing negotiations to finalize regulations, they may very well determine what the future of this industry is. And for good or for bad, without ratifying UNCLOS, the US just doesn't have much of a say here, which is why in the meantime, I gotta pass the question off to you. What are your thoughts with everything we just talked about here?